Canada-US free trade rift deepens, from boycotts to global realignment. Introduction. Tensions between Canada and the United States have escalated sharply in 2025, undermining the foundations of the once stable USMCA trade agreement. U.S. officials accuse Canada of pulling the rug out from the deal, while Canada pushes back with retaliatory tariffs, boycotts, and trade diversification strategies. This economic and political standoff is reshaping North American trade dynamics and sparking major global realignments. 1. U.S. alcohol exports to Canada collapse amid boycott. Canada's consumer backlash has hit American liquor hard. In early 2025, U.S. exports of spirits to Canada plummeted over 60%. Wine exports dropped 67%, amounting to a loss of more than $173 million United States dollars for California producers alone. The Ontario Liquor Control Board, Canada's largest single alcohol buyer, suspended U.S. imports, intensifying the hit to American wineries and distilleries. The Distilled Spirits Council reported a 62% drop in U.S. spirits exports to Canada. Canadian consumers are increasingly turning to domestic options, with sales of Canadian-made alcohol rising 14% year-on-year. Some provinces like Alberta briefly eased restrictions and allowed limited imports under a 25% tariff, causing a short-term bump in U.S. alcohol sales, but this remains the exception. This boycott reflects broader public anger over U.S. trade tactics and has become a symbolic gesture of economic resistance. 2. Canadian travel to the U.S. at a record low. Travel from Canada to the U.S. continues to decline, marking 7 straight months of reduced cross-border movement. In July 2025, car travel from Canada to the U.S. dropped 37%. Air travel declined 26% compared to July 2024. Surveys show 63% of Canadians now avoid visiting the U.S. Only 36% of respondents feel the U.S. is welcoming to diverse travelers. This decline is attributed to rising nationalism, anti-American sentiment, and policy concerns. Canadians cite not only Trump-era rhetoric but also controversial U.S. positions on climate, immigration, and global conflicts. 3. Canada revives Mercosur talks for trade diversification. To reduce economic dependency on the United States, Canada has turned south. Ottawa is actively negotiating with Brazil to revive the stalled Mercosur trade deal, aiming to bolster access to South American markets. Maninder Sidhu, Canadian Minister of Trade, is scheduled to visit Brasilia on August 25. Canada hopes to finalize a new negotiation framework by October 2025. The revived deal would improve access to agriculture, minerals, and manufacturing, offering an alternative to strained U.S. supply chains. This move mirrors Canada's broader strategy of trade diversification, following similar efforts with the EU, UK, and Indo-Pacific nations. 4. Strengthening Mexico-Canada relations. Another strategic pillar of Canada's shift is deepening trade ties with Mexico. With U.S. protectionism rising, Canada has renewed its focus on bilateral cooperation with Mexico, especially in energy, infrastructure, and digital industries. Foreign Affairs Minister Anita Anand and Finance Minister François-Philippe Champagne traveled to Mexico City in early August to finalize a slate of agreements. Mexico is expected to replace the U.S. as Canada's second-largest trading partner by early 2026 if current trends persist. Talks included joint investment in clean energy corridors and rail infrastructure, designed to bypass U.S. territory entirely. 5. Tariff escalations. Trump increases pressure. President Donald Trump issued a fresh wave of tariffs against Canadian imports in late July. Tariffs increased from 25% to 35% on most Canadian imports starting August 1, 2025. An additional 40% tariff applies to goods routed through third countries, aimed at closing loopholes. Trump cited Canada's recognition of Palestine, digital tax on U.S. tech firms, and drug export disputes as justifications. These actions further destabilize the USMCA framework, even though much of the agreement remains technically in effect. 6. Canada holds ground under USMCA protections. Despite the friction, USMCA continues to offer important trade protections. Nearly 100% of Canadian energy exports and 95% of all other exports to the U.S. remain tariff-free. However, the U.S. has carved out exceptions, with 50% tariffs on steel and aluminum and 25% on automobiles. Canadian officials have leveraged these protections to prevent full-scale trade collapse, even as negotiations remain frozen. 7. Political reactions in Canada, from sovereignty to strategy. Canada's internal political landscape has shifted to support trade independence. Prime Minister Mark Carney has taken a pro-sovereignty stance while moderating rhetoric to keep economic avenues open. Carney proposed the One Canadian Economy Act, aimed at eliminating interprovincial trade barriers and strengthening internal supply chains. A national consumer boycott of U.S. products, unofficially endorsed by several provinces, continues to gain support. Doug Ford, Premier of Ontario, warned Canadians not to trust Trump and emphasized the need to prepare for the worst if USMCA is reopened unilaterally before the 2026 review. 8. Summary table. Category highlights: alcohol boycott. U.S. liquor sales to Canada dropped 60% plus. Ontario halts American alcohol imports. Tourism declined. 7 months of declining Canadian travel to U.S. 63% of Canadians reluctant to visit. Mercosur talks. Canada reopens South American deal. Brazil, Argentina in renewed discussions. Mexico partnerships. Bilateral clean energy, infrastructure focus. Mexico rising as key partner. Tariff war. Trump raises tariffs to 35%-40%. Focus on digital tax and foreign policy rifts. USMCA shield. Most Canadian exports still protected. Steel, auto sectors face new levies. Domestic policy shift. Carney promotes internal economic autonomy. Provinces support U.S. boycott. 9. What to watch next? Mercosur progress. Will Canada finalize new trade pacts with Brazil and others before year-end? U.S. election impact. A Trump re-election could lock in long-term isolationist policies. Consumer backlash. Will Canadian boycotts expand to other industries like tech or tourism? USMCA review 2026. Will the agreement survive its next formal review amid growing tensions? Global trade shifts. Could Canada become a bridge economy between Latin America, Europe, and Asia? 10. Final word. The Canada-US trade relationship is at a historic crossroads. What began as mutual retaliatory tariffs has evolved into a deeper ideological and economic rift, with Canada actively seeking new partnerships and consumers rejecting American products. While USMCA remains intact for now, its future appears increasingly fragile. With nationalism rising on both sides of the border, the next year may determine whether North American trade fractures further, or if pragmatism can revive cooperation.